Just on. Something about your experience.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Alyssa Karpinka, and I'm the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. Just to note that this event is being live streamed to our YouTube page, so please be aware of the webcam behind you. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of The Broken Heart of Winter by Judy LeBlanc, published by Acadian Press. Thank you to Judy for being here tonight, and to our special guest for the evening, D. Hobsbawn-Smith. I'll tell you a bit about them now. Judy is a writer from Fanny Bay, BC. Several of her stories and essays have been published in Canadian literary journals. A collection of her short stories, The Promise of Water, was published by Ullachen Books in 2017. She won the Sheldon Curry Fiction Prize in 2012, the Islands Fiction Contest in 2015, and she's been a runner-up for fiction contests with Room, Prism International, and the CBC. Though she was born and raised on the West Coast, she has Acadian ancestry on her father's side. She was the founder of the Fat Oyster Reading Series in Fanny Bay and taught creative writing at North Island College for several years. D. Hobsbawn-Smith's award-winning poetry, essays, and fiction is often influenced by her history as a chef, restaurateur, and slow food activist. She lives rurally west of Saskatoon in Treaty 6 territory. Her 8th book, Bread and Water, Essays, published by University of Regina Press in 2021, won the 2022 Saskatchewan Book Awards Nonfiction Award and was a finalist for the City of Saskatoon Award. Bread and Water also won Taste Canada's 2022 Gold Medal Book Award in the Culinary Narratives category. Her novel, Danceland Diary, came out in the fall of 2022. Her most recent release, a poetry collection titled Among the Untamed, came out in April 2023. I will now turn things over to Dee. Please give her a warm welcome.
First of all, the thank yous. I am always grateful to McNally Robinson and Melissa, hardworking woman, for organizing and expediting and managing hello people in internet land. So thank you for managing all of that back there with such grace. It's really good. Really appreciate it. And thank you to those of you who are here in the live audience and to those of you out there in internet land who are tuning in. What else do I want to say for thank you? Thank you to Judy for reaching out and saying, would you like to read with me? Thank you. It's lovely. And it gives me a chance to set down my poetry book, which I've been reading for the last month, and read something from Danceland Diary, my novel. So yay. Danceland Diary has a little bit of a, well, has some things that originated in my family, in that the main characters are descended from Hutterites, and they live west of Saskatoon in small towns and or farms and or rural residences in and around that area where the Hutterites in Saskatchewan are originally congregated when they were arriving as off-colony Hutterites before there were any colonies that developed. So I'm related to half the people in and around Dalmeny and Borden and Langham. We're all third cousins at least. So this novel has its feet in Hutterite background, but it also has its feet in intergenerational trauma and the kinds of damage that people unwittingly share and pass on to their family members and their descendants. And it isn't always physical trauma. There are other kinds of trauma too that go on through the generations. So this is part of this novel is a mystery, as our main character, Luca, tries to solve the question of what happened to her mother, whose name was Lark, whom we never see, right? She's the ghost that haunts the whole novel. So there's that, but there's also the question that becomes clear as Luca, our 21st century protagonist, as she learns what the story of her grandmother, her beloved Anki, and what happened to her in her 20s as a young woman in Saskatchewan in the dirty 40s. Right. So those are the two most important characters. I'm going to jump right in today and read a segment where it will be no surprise for the audience to realize that Luca's grandmother, Anki, dies. Luca has returned to Saskatchewan because her grandmother's in her 90s, and her grandmother dies a few months after Luca comes back because her grandmother is elderly and Luca's sister needs some care and support in taking care of her in her times. So grandmother Anki has passed, the funeral has happened, and the two sisters, which is to say Luca, 30 years old, single mother, and her sister, who is 2 years older, and her name is Connie, are investigating the house where they were raised by their grandmother, now that their grandmother's died, and they're going through things and finding unexpected things. So we're going to pick it up at a point where they start finding things they didn't expect to find. Squatting to rub my protesting leg after I barked my shin on the Schleifbank, which is an old bench-like couch that pulls out to make a bed, and it has a storage cabinet underneath it. Old Hutterite, very sturdy, multifunctional furniture. Squatting to rub my protesting leg, I swivel and shove all the books and papers on top of it aside, then heave the bench top up, revealing a storage space filled with fabric. 5 neatly folded patchwork quilts emerge, one after another. I set them on the table to look more closely. Fading triangles and diamonds and strips of coral and copper and yellow and teal cotton are stitched to tiny work squares of red flannel, bands of blue broadcloth, threadbare green ribbons and sunny plaid, silken embroidery floss in herringbone stitches like bird's feet, cross stitches like safety pins. So lovely. Who made them? What did they celebrate? These are gorgeous, Connie says. I've never seen them before. Anki must have forgotten them. Beautiful, all hand quilted. Turn them over, Luca. Most quilters sign their work. They might have labels. Never realized you knew so much about this. Connie laughs. You have more to thank quilting for than you know. Quilting teaches patience, the art of not hurrying things, focus. My therapist suggested years ago that I do something with my hands. I can teach you if you'd like, when we both have time. I don't know. I love looking at them, but I don't know if I want to go to all that effort, says the gardener of tropical plants. Connie laughs. She flips over the top quilt. Here, look, this log cabin has a hand-embroidered label that says Matilda Cheddar Walter, 1899, for Clara's birth. And this double wedding ring was made by her as well for Clara's wedding to Jordan Mueller in 1917. The other Jordan, Luca. And this one of flying geese made by Clara and Tilly for Anki's birth in 1918. This is real family history, Con says. All these people, they're members of our family. Look, you can hang them on the wall, Luca. They're precious things. Far too beautiful to let Jordan use during 6. No, we should use them, Luca says. That's what they're here for. They're irreplaceable, Luca. I wish I knew what those fabrics are cut from. It's all there. Births, marriages, deaths, children. Decipherable if you know the code of where and what the fabric pieces came from. Just a jumble of scraps if you don't. What else did she hire them? Con leans forward and peers into the dark interior of the Schleifbank. She scrabbles about and sits up in triumph, clutching a scribbler amid a few dust bunnies with a yellow cardboard cover, MCMXLIE, inscribed in emphatic black lines on its front. 1944. Beneath it, Enki's maiden name, Charlotte Walter. Inside, each page is covered in tight black rows of a familiar, close-written angular script with a decided cant to the east and an authoritative downstroke. Enki's writing. Clippings, photos, letters, and envelopes protrude like aging ears from the pages. Not just a diary then, but a record of a life. Luca, we found ourselves a gold mine. I take the book from Connie's hands. The fine script is difficult to read. This will need close attention. Do you want to take it home at night to work through? Connie says, no, I'll be on tight deadlines. She's a journalist. I'll be on tight deadlines after missing work for a week, and I'll feel too rushed to pay close attention. I won't have time. You need a project. You read it. Now, what about the bookshelves? Hang on, this notebook. Enki was so private. You think we should burn it? Are you nuts? Connie says. You're the one who's been sagging around like a sack of old spuds about wanting to know more about the family. Burn it? Not on your life, Luca. You read it. Fill me in. Now, those things on the top of the bookshelves, you can reach them all. Luca's a tall woman. We're all tall. Just a sec, I say, and I set the notebook on the kitchen table beside Enki's finished puzzle, stroking its cover for a minute before I return to the parlor shelf. Dad's trophies from rodeos, I say. Enki's King James. As the worn leather Bible tilts in my hands, two pieces of paper slip out, the sheets folded and refolded, the creases wearing thin. I pick them up and unfold both. They contain spare words in barely legible scrawls. Mother's writing. I read the oldest aloud. 19 October 1965. I'm off. Vancouver is expensive. Please send money. You'll be glad to know I had an A. Don't want to clutter up the world with more unwanted kids. Look. An A. I sit down abruptly and Con takes my hand. My stomach tenses with remembered stress, my own mental and emotional upheaval, the wrestling match of a decision that led to my having Jordan. Now I can't imagine life without him. I could have had a big brother or a sister, says Con, subdued for once. It must have been terrible for her. Abortion was still illegal, dangerous, probably expensive, hard to find, risky. She must have been scared out of her mind. Luca, did you ever consider? Don't ask, Con. I was just going to say how brave you are to be a single mom. Braver than mother. That's harsh, Con. No, just realistic. She shouldn't have had us. Con's mouth twists. I reread the letter. 1965. What was Vancouver like back then? The only already existed, I know that. Was the city just as dangerous? And then I remembered. Mother went to live at Marina's as a teenager in 1959. This means that somehow Enki and Mother reconciled in the intervening years. A few moments pass before I'm ready to read the second, even briefer letter out loud. Surprised that my voice doesn't waver. Same handwriting. 9 November 1975. I'm off. Coming home. Married cowboy. Name's A.J. Decker. Train next Monday. L. Do you remember him? I say. Connie squints at the sky through the open window. He was kind, funny, patient, an amazing horseman. I remember those trophies. We look up at the shelf above our heads. Do you remember the riding lessons? He spent hours with us on those horses. I wish we'd had more years with him. We had him. Let's be glad of that. And we were better off with Enki than we would have been with Mother, Connie says, her voice level, simply stating facts. Mothers who drink, she says, have meant plenty. She holds out the Bible. I take it and riffle through the well-thumbed pages marked with half a dozen bookmarks. The Bible falls open at a garish blue bookmark embossed with a gilt cross, and we read a long list of begats. Another bookmark, and then another. One more flip of the page brings me to a yellow sun marker illuminating the story of David and Goliath. Then the thin page is open to a worn brown leather bookmark lodged in Exodus. Come, give a listen. Yankees underlined this. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children unto the third and to the fourth generation. And then later on, here in Ezekiel, more underlining, but it contradicts this, what I just read you. Listen, the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. Iniquity, I say. What was Yankee fretting about? But Connie grows impatient. Never mind that for now, enough holy writ. You keep the trophies. I have no use for you. But what about the other house, that little one? I bet you haven't been in it since forever. Second little house set back in the meadow on the yard and farm. Let's go see what she left in it, Con says. It's not a treasure hunt, Connie. I say, vaguely offended by her enthusiasm. Sure it is. I have to go to work tomorrow, so let's just do this now, Connie says briskly. Got a flashlight? Gloves. Give me a minute. Straighten the bookshelves and replace the Bible. Then I refold the quilts and tuck them back into the schlafbunk. We traipse to the tiny house, sheltered, forgotten, unused. Rarely does a building go unused on a Saskatchewan farm. The extreme weather conspires with unendingly tough times to dictate that everything have a practical purpose. After Ankie and old Vether Paul moved in with us, what could they have done with this small building? It's too isolated to rent, too small to serve for much other than storage. The door's metal hasp resists, so Con breaks a length of carragana branch free from the overgrown shrub and hands it to me. The slider gives on the fourth whack. Con pushes past me. I grab at her wrist, but she ignores me. It's fine, Luca. Come on, don't be silly. I recognize 2 rooms. Wood stove, sink, an icebox, cobwebs. Then Con's flashlight catches an answering gleam on the stained wooden floor, a trapdoor with its pull ring. Within a couple of minutes, I have the ring pried up and loosened. The trapdoor gives way after 3 businesslike tugs. I'm standing too close to the void. I ease back from the edge, but down the steep stairs Connie goes. A minute passes, vertigo rushing through me. Then I clamber awkwardly after her while Connie shines the flashlight at the steps beneath my feet. The bar of light reveals a shelf-lined room with rough cement walls, empty except for a single row of empty canning jars on one shelf and a pair of wooden chairs poised against the south wall, a wooden box balanced across the seat. It looks like a set out of a fairy tale, the perfect stage for evil doings in a dungeon. Con directs the light at the box. Even through the dust and grime, I can see that it's two-toned, with a lid that sits square and snug. The stairs, awkward coming down, are treacherous on the uphill trip. Shallow risers and narrow treads combining with a steep pitch, more suited to a ladder than stairs in a house. Still, I make it up and through the trapdoor without losing my balance or grip, the box secure under one arm, on my heels. Pass up those 2 chairs, I suggest. She scuttles back down, and first one, then the second appears. We crouch, breathless, in the flashlight's beam on the kitchen floor. A slight shove releases the trapdoor. It drops into place with a muffled bang, the cellar closing off again, putting in mind of Bluebeard maybe, or one of Scheherazad's tales of oubliettes and forgotten women. A shivery thought standing in the presence of the unknown. In a few minutes, we have everything safely in my kitchen. The chairs are obviously handmade as well and look like matches for the pair beside the parlor desk, with spindle backs and carved top rails. A few swipes with a damp cloth reveal that both chairs and box are made of dark walnut and paler maple, gleaming surfaces. Someone lovingly sanded and polished these. The box seems an understated thing, the size of a shoebox, handmade by a craftsman who knew his tools and his or her own skill. The box opens willingly. Within lies another yellow notebook. Stopping there. Read the book. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to read through an audience of enthusiastic readers and listeners. So please come on up and give a warm welcome, would you please, to Judy LeBlanc.
Thank you, Dee. And yeah, thank you to McNally Robinson for welcoming me and for doing these readings. It's just great that you do that. And to everyone who's come out for this reading, as well as to those of you on the streaming, or what did you call it? Interland or something that maybe you didn't call it internet, but Dee. So it's really nice to actually be here in Saskatoon. I have a real warm spot for Saskatoon. I've been here off and on over the years, and I just want to say that I'm jealous of the rain. So, I come from the West Coast, and this is a strange world we're living in. And a West Coaster is jealous of the rain you're getting in Saskatchewan. So it's kind of the state of the world, maybe, and I was thinking about choosing what to read for tonight, because being one of those people that we actually had a conversation about at lunch today, we second guess and, go back and forth. I changed it all this morning, so I'm really hoping it works. But part of the reason I did that is because of the state of the world. And since I read in Edmonton, there's been a lot of talk from the time I got off the plane and into the smoke bank and a number of things about the state of the world. I mean, who hasn't had those conversations in the last little while? And often they turn to the question of hope, how does that show up in our writing and in our world? And so that's where I get to the second guessing part. I thought this morning, I've written a book about one of another Canadian tragedy, a tragic event, the expulsion of the Acadians, which happened back in 1755 and went on for a number of years. And how can there be hopefulness in these tragedies that are coming forward, these tragic stories, which in itself may be hopeful. Anyway, what I did this morning is I went through my book and tried to find places where there was at least a hint of hopefulness, which was a good exercise. I hope, because exercise and hope worked. So, my father, or on my father's side, I do have Acadian ancestry, but I was raised without knowing much about it at all, really next to nothing, just that I had it. I was raised on a very Anglo West Coast, and my father left Nova Scotia to come out here, or to the West Coast, with his family when he was a teenager. So left whatever remnants of that history behind in many ways. And then I got a family tree. I find that so interesting, Dee, that we're both writing from some kind of history, and we're trying to find out more about it. And so that's what happened. I did a lot of research, and this book came out. Now, the book I need to explain is actually in 3 different sections. And in fact, could almost be 3 novellas from different time periods, ranging from contemporary back to 1755, from the perspective of 3 women who are related, and in the same family line. We have quite a gap in years there. So intergenerational, and I too was interested in trauma or intergenerational trauma, but also, yeah, I guess this is part of it, just those patterns that play out in families. So anyway, I'm going to jump around a little bit here, and hopefully that's okay. But I'm going to start with the first section of the book, which is the contemporary section. I imagined it to be somewhere around 2001. And this section is from the point of view of Lise. So I don't know that I need to tell you, I'll fill in as I go, but where it's necessary. Lise pulled the sleep mask over her eyes. This is right at the beginning of the book. Cushioned by the white noise of the plane's engines, she sank deeper into her seat and wiggled her toes in the fleece socks she brought in her carry-on. She drifted in a familiar twilight state, not quite asleep, not quite awake. She was on the early flight from Vancouver to Halifax, where her son would meet her at the airport. Since she'd last seen Daniel, she'd become a nocturnal creature, a woman who worked nights in a bakery, with yeast, peaks of egg whites, and sweet mixes. She felt most alive in the quiet hours after midnight, when the muscles in her arms and joints of her fingers moved to the rhythm of the dough. During the day, in an effort to force sleep, she'd wear earplugs and an eye mask. Sometimes she'd manage to forget she was a mother. A sour human smell intermingled with the slight stink of fuel and stale coffee. Lisa's mind darted between thoughts as she shifted her body from one position to the other. Sighing, she gave up on any idea of sleep, pulled herself upright, and removed the eye mask. She slid up the window blind. A rosy glow streaked the sky. They were flying into the sunrise. The plane thrust forward at 900 kilometers an hour, and an enormous geography unfolded as if in a time-lapse film. Foothills appeared to heave upward in slow motion through mists of spun cotton and became jagged snow-covered peaks, and dawn erupted. Beneath the plain, the foothills resolved into snow-covered prairie, etched with secondary highways and snaking rivers that ranged across a frozen white plain. Come the breaking of winter, land as flat and blank as a scroll would be inscribed with a new story. 3 years of silence stood between Lise and her son. Things would be different with Daniel. She wouldn't fail him this time. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, and actually we're going to jump behind because this is 3 days earlier. And she's got a call from her ex-husband and Daniel's father to say that he's heard from Daniel, with whom she's been estranged for 3 years. Neither parent has really heard much from him, a little bit, mostly Dad has heard. And so Dick has called her and said, we need to meet and talk about this. So off she goes to the Bay Center in Victoria to make food court. Dick sat hunched over a table in the food court of the Bay Center, sucking green liquid through a straw jammed into a plastic Jugo juice cup. A bicycle helmet rocked on the floor at his feet. Hiya, you rode in this weather? She shrugged off her coat. Why wouldn't I? He looked up from his phone, quizzical and half amused. I'll be back in a minute. She normally ate healthy, a lot of greens, managed to resist overindulging in the heavy breads and pastries she worked with nightly. But something perverse, maybe that ever-present bicycle helmet, sent her to New York fries. Dick had taken up serious cycling days after Daniel was born. A few months into it, and he began competing in marathons, wore spandex over his tight buns and muscular legs. She once thought of him as good-looking with his mop of blonde hair and sturdy build. Now when she looked at him, she saw a Ken doll, handsome, plastic, and rigid. It was she who drove a colicky infant around the city in the middle of the night. They were both teachers then, and 6 months after Daniel was born, she returned to work, but she was the one who got up for childhood illnesses and bad dreams. Dick slept because he was going for a principalship, and she only taught grade 11 English, which allowed her to rush home after school to be with Daniel. Dick also slept so he could cycle in the evenings and on weekends. When he was 10, Daniel fell off Dick's bike, broke his arm, and as far as she knew, never got on a bike again. She bought a large carton of fries, doused it in vinegar and salt, and dropped it onto the middle of the table. Steam rose between them. Have some if you want. Still working the night shift at a bakery? Yeah, I'm sorry I'm late. I didn't get much sleep this morning. He leaned back in his chair and spread his legs apart. His black loafers shone against the dull tile. Lise shoved a fry into her mouth. Still with the Department of Mediocre Education? He popped his phone into his pocket. Are we going to do this? It's what they did, no matter how long it had been since they'd seen each other. Immediately, they fell into a vat of acid. Lise didn't like herself when she was with her ex-husband. So I'm going to jump ahead in this conversation. It goes on a bit. He talks about Daniel being back in Halifax and he's gotten into some trouble. Just let me make sure. Yeah. So he's gotten into a little bit of trouble and they're continuing this conversation. And she says to him all of a sudden, "You don't want to go to Halifax, do you, Dick?" Dick rested his elbows on the table and folded his hands near his mouth so that she had to strain to hear him. "I'm getting married." When? They've already discussed the marriage a little bit. He's broken the news to her. When? In 2 weeks, but there's a lot to do in my job. I can't take any time off. You don't deserve him. You can go. I can't. She leaned back. Nausea racked her stomach. She should have eaten something more substantial. She needed sleep. Why? I thought that's all you wanted. You've been badgering me ever since we split. Did he call? Did he call? Why exactly can't you go? He wants you. Even if that's true, maybe it's not about what he wants. I'm in the middle of packing and moving into a one-bedroom condo. I've sold the house. A shadow passed over his face, only for a split second, but she caught it, and his eyes scrunched as if he were in pain. I thought you'd be happy to hear it. With you getting married, I'm sure you could use the money. It's high time, and I'm not saying that just because of the money. We need to move on, you and I. What about Daniel? He's an adult now. Barely, and we missed that part, didn't we? Lise said. Him becoming one. We weren't there, were we? We haven't lost him. He could come out here. Would he come now? Dick shook his head. He can't leave until after his court date. I don't have any money, Dick. I make crap wages. Why do you work in that place? A bakery clerk? You were a good teacher, Lise, better than me. I'm nothing more than a bureaucrat. Thank you for saying so, but I'm training as a night baker. I'm not a bakery clerk. The point is you have choices. And I've made them, haven't I? He stared at her, or he stared as if he were seeing her for the first time. I've got to go, he said. Like she'd hold him back, yet they weren't finished. They were never finished, Dick and she, when they talked. It had always been this way between them, gridlocked for hours and hours until they wore each other out without any resolution. The images from her marriage that would like hives irritate her memory for the rest of her life, including cursing in full volume at one another over the baby's wading pool in the backyard. Daniel between them, silent for once. Maybe all along it was only for the sake of the fights. She sometimes thought if it weren't for those fights, they might have split sooner. The death of her parents and finally the disappearance of Daniel woke them to the wasteland they created from which they could no longer coax life. Wait, I thought you might want this. From her bag, she pulled out the photo of Daniel on the tricycle. As Dick examined it, his face softened. We made a cute kid, didn't we? She nodded. He never did take to the bike, the little monkey. He popped the photo into his pocket, looked away, and bit his bottom lip. It was always you he wanted, Lise. It was always you and Daniel. Now he's not a baby, it's you he's been calling, she said. He shook his head. I'll give you the money for the flight. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to, again, only now we're on Ile Madame, which is in Castle Strait between Nova Scotia mainland and Cape Breton Island. And it is 1832. And just a second. This section, this is the second section of the book, and this is told through the perspective of Appoline, who has been left, she's 18 years old and has been left to watch over these 5 women from her family for a winter because her brother has moved on to, has married and moved to another part of the Cancel Strait, another small village. And they can't leave because Grandmère, who is almost 100 years old, refuses to leave. So this will give you just a little picture of life for these women in this little bay in 1832. This is after the expulsion. So the expulsion was in 1755, and the Acadians came back to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And they, although they originally had the richest growing lands in Nova Scotia, they were relegated by the government to these kind of rocky outposts where they had to learn to fish. So there was no more farming. So Appoline has just come up from that beach. Mama is praying again. She kneels on a bed of straw at her place by the woodshed where she's free of interruptions. She's bundled against the cold with her bare hands pressed together and her eyes scrunched shut. My grandmère's name, Anne, stutters again and again out of her holy mutterings like a horn in the fog. God to Mama is as stern and of the flesh as the top-hatted, cane-tapping headmaster at the English school in Ayrshire. Papa had a different kind of religion. He used to say I was a spooky girl who spoke the language of the clams and the trees, though he said it with affection. It was he who showed me how to walk in the woods as light-footed as deer, to listen to the heartwood of a tree, to lie on my belly on the shore and watch for the minutest movement of the clams beneath the sand. As for Benjamin and my older brothers, he taught them only what was necessary to keep the family fed, fishing, hunting. Once, Papa told me that what I heard deep in the sand and branches of the tree was the voice of God speaking through his creatures. It irked Mama, this thing my father loved in me that was lacking in her. When I was a child, she called me lazy and a daydreamer, but since Papa died, she's come to rely on me. When Mama hears me approach, she opens her eyes and scrambles to her feet. Loose strands of oily hair fall across her face from under her bonnet. The hem of her skirt is threadbare. There are shadows under her eyes and her shoulders sag with exhaustion. She won't be happy until I am as weary as she, and my shoulders do the same. Every time I look at her, I want to look away. She'll outlive us all, she says, just to spite us. I sigh. Grandmère will be 100 this year. Soon she'll be gone and we can join Benjamin in River Bourgeois. I brushed past her to gather food for the fire. In the house, I find Emily swirling around Grandmère like waves around a rock, her 7-year-old voice chattering like a gull. She trips on a runner of the old woman's beloved rocking chair and quickly recovers before falling into her lap. A tremor shudders through Grandmère's tiny body as she raises her head slowly and narrows her eyes. With her sight nearly gone, the old woman's other senses are acute. A hissing sound rises through her chest and escapes from between her thin lips. More and more, it's as though she has no further need of language. Emily leaps back, whimpers, and grabs my arm. Come help me light the fire, I say. My little sister, clutching the back of my trousers, follows me to the stove. Grandmère's voice fills the room. You know, child, why you have no teeth? I have some, squeaks Emily. It's because you suck the giant maple dry every spring and all that sweetness is rotting your teeth before you're even old enough for Menzies. When she talks, Emily's breath whistles between the gap in her teeth, causing Grandmère to ball her hands into fists and tighten her lips. No, I don't, says Emily, shoving a thumb into her mouth. Her eyes fill with tears. Open the stove for me, Em, I say as I dump the wood in the box. I face Grandmère, who sees me only as a shimmering blur of light. Poor Emily, I say, she's growing like a larch and her hunger can't keep up with her lengthening limbs. You know nothing of hunger, none of you, Grandmère speaks quietly and faces the corner of the room, where behind a curtain, Aunt Catherine, her sister-in-law, shares a bed with Mama. Grandmère drops her head to her chest, surrendering to a nap. She refuses the white bonnet she's worn most of her life and prefers to wear her silver hair wrapped in a high bundle on her head. When she walks, it looks as if she might lose her balance and topple any moment. I leave Emily to shove sticks into the fire while I wrap Grandmère's shawl tighter around her shoulders. She stirs awake. Appoline, it's me. She fumbles for my hand. Don't ever marry an Englishman. No, Grandmère, never, I say. I was like you, always watching and staying apart, like a heron. She hums and taps her toes. She's told me this so often, I know what she'll say next, but I'm patient with her. Marry a man like your grandpa who can play the fiddle. A jolly man. You'll want a jolly man, so long as he's not English. Okay, so that's Appoline. Now we're going back further in time to Grandmère's point of view. And this is just days before Grandmère dies, I think. Yet, actually, I'm just gonna push something. No. Okay. So we're going back to the final section of the book. And this is Acadia, Grandmère remembering Acadia of 1755 and the expulsion, and in her voice. And she's 100 years old, days before she dies. So I'll start from the beginning of this section. No one knows about Simon and me. In years to come, there'll be nothing left of our lives except a scattered collection of names on a skeletal family tree, a winter tree bare of leaves. I imagine a daughter of many daughters born a century or more from now, a storyteller perhaps. She'll conjure me with Simon there on the riverbank holding the Charleville. It's a musket, an old musket. But this is not the secret of which I am most ashamed. I'm proud of the way Appoline handles that musket. Yet I'm afraid the Charleville will hang like a curse over the women in this family long after I die. I've lived nearly 100 years now, and some days my mind drifts away from the women in this house. It's then that I find myself in the past. And the other days, it's as if I'm in a time that's not yet come. The face of a future daughter is as dear as that of the granddaughter who bagged a black duck from me this very morning. When you're as old as I am, you begin to realize that time is a restless wind on the sea, and the order of events is not so important. Some days it's 1754 again, and I'm in Grand Pré. I'm bending and swaying in the summer fields with my mother. Her muscles rippling like water over stones, perspiration staining her dress, while the sickle slices slender shafts of wheat that collapse into golden piles. I can't keep up to her. My eyes prefer to wander across the yellow fields to the blue sea and out beyond Blamedon Point. After I was married, Mama resisted pulling me back from my daydreams, at least when Renee was around. Still, I could see in the set of her jaw, the space between her eyebrows, her disapproval. If I'd known how little time we had left together, I'd have done more to please her, if it had been in my power. For I still think that we're born with a certain nature that no amount of bending will change. But I would have tried harder, if I'd known. Was it last night I dreamt of a full moon above the ruddy contours of Minas Basin below Grand Pré? Was it dream or memory? My René, sturdy and square-shouldered, lay on the shore with his head in my lap. His hand, his big hand, twice the size of mine, splayed on my swollen belly under my petticoat. The tip of his finger was cold and rough on my taut flesh. He told me to guess what he traced on my belly. I lay on my back, my face open to the moon. The moon, I said. His finger dropped like a star to my womanhood. I screeched and scooped beach mud, smeared it on his face so his cheeks and the tip of his nose turned rust in the moonlight. He bared down harder, a big smile beneath his beard, and I couldn't stop giggling. That was the last night we'd spend in Ground Bray, my sweet Ground Bray. We made love on the shore, our bodies as slippery and smooth as the mud, our first child, Matern, growing between us. And it was as if the shore held and molded us until we were up the basin. Okay, not to end on a sex scene. So this is the very end of this section. And yeah, she's like moments to dance, the idea. So I no longer know if I'm dreaming or awake. Here now, I just want to say to you, hopefully this is the hopeful part. Here now, I'm at the marsh on a spring morning, surrounded by the uproar of 1,000 birds, and the marsh becomes a road where I walk with my own kin. The crowd swells to hundreds, maybe thousands. We surge as if a great river, making all manner of noise. Some bang on cooking pots and others on bass drums. Children twirl colorful noisemakers. Beneath the uproar, voices rise in the songs of my tongue, in the songs my tongue has always known. Like a flock of birds, flag striped, blue, white, and red, flutter above the crowd. On the blue stripe shines the gold star of the Blessed Virgin. The flag's image is painted on the bare chests of young men, and the cheeks of children are dotted with its single star. Shouts of Je suis Acadian ride above the clamor and throng. A daughter of a time I've not yet known will be swept into the motion of the crowd, not quite of the people that flow around her, and yet affected with their lightness and energy. My memory is a rich country. Thank you.
All right, we're going to do a brief set change here, and then we've got a little bit of time for some questions. Side time. Hey, light the fire.
So where did that story come from? Is that your family?
Yes, my father, on my father's side, we're descended from Acadians. So, yeah, I got this family tree that was done by Stephen White, who's actually a renowned genealogist. And I did meet him in New Brunswick at the University in Moncton, and he told me that we established we were fifth cousins once removed. His original name, of course, was LeBlanc, but it got changed somewhere in his line. It got changed to White. So that's what they did. But yeah, so I was quite enthralled by this family tree. That I mean, I was an adult then. I knew nothing more before that, but I started researching. I just became absolutely fascinated with the whole story. And my father knew very little. My grandfather was the last in our line to speak French. So,
Research is one of the things I wrote down while I was listening to you read. Because we both have novels that are set in previous eras, I know I did a lot. And I'm curious about how many side trips you ended up doing that informed you but didn't end up on the page.
quite a bit. Yeah, this book swelled and shrunk many times over the writing, because the research was, quite seductive.
Yeah,
You
stay in
did.
the, yes, in the local history room here at the library, the downtown Saskatoon library. We spent a lot of time in there looking at maps, the lists of what businesses were on what streets in particular years that I was interested in, and who was working and who, just the composition of the city was part of it. But also I was interested in the arrival of the Hutterites in the 1870s and what happened to them when they came mostly through Ellis Island and worked their way west and then came up into Canada in 1900, and where they dispersed to. And the fact that colonies weren't formed, they were Hutterites in Europe lived in colonies. And when they arrived in Saskatchewan, well, it was still the Northwest Territories. What was the name of it? Northwest Territories. They didn't form colonies. They said, "Oh my gosh, look at all this land, and we can all own our own land."
Okay.
So colonies were not formed. They were known. My people were known as the Prairie Light or the Prairie Folk, as opposed to the various sects that developed in colonies as people moved around into Western states and more into Western Canada. So you're right, completely seductive, this thing of history, yeah.
How much did you know about your Hutterite ancestry? But yeah, I find that so interesting. I knew just about zero too before I did the research.
It was, I didn't know anything. I didn't, and then my mother would start talking about it, and I asked my mother who's still alive and has an amazing trapdoor of a memory. I would talk to her about members of the family, the extended family, the family beyond the extended family, all of whom were Hutterites and who married more Hutterites or else the occasional Mennonite. But no, I knew nothing about the traditions or the practices. I hadn't visited a colony. It was big lust for
So what is it, in terms of the curiosity that drove you both? Is this something that happens at a particular point in life? Or what is it, the state of the world that somehow starts to spark more interest in history? What was the point of the curiosity for both of you?
Well, for me, it was something very, very specific that my mother and her sister, my aunt Lila, said regularly when I was a young woman. They'd talk about their grandfather who disappeared as a young man, and they didn't know. He disappeared, he vanished in the 19 teens sometime, or something like that, without leaving a trace, but leaving behind a young wife with lots and lots of kids. So at the time, there were a couple stories that circulated in the family, but it was all just maybes. Maybe he went back down across the border and joined the American army to fight in World War I, but that was unlikely because Hutterites are pacifists. So, I kind of went, no, he wouldn't have done that. But the other thing that my mother said over and over was, well, I think someone put him down a well. But then, total pragmatist, farmer to the end, she would say, yeah, but who would ruin a perfectly good well on the dry land? So that stuck with me, this image of a body going down a well and no one knowing what happened. So I hung on to it, and it became a spark that turned into this novel.
You know, that down the well story, I've heard it in the area that I lived in as well for a couple of missing people. I wonder if it's one of those prairie folklores.
It could be, well, it's ended up in there. Yeah. So it's definitely part of the folklore, I think. Yeah.
Well, everybody had a will.
But who was wrong?
That water mystery in them. Yeah. Well, I don't know if there was one thing. I remember getting this family tree and definitely, and there was this surprising. I was able to track the ancestors back in my line. I mean, not thoroughly, but fairly well, because there were a lot of church records and things were destroyed, but they were Catholic. There were a lot of records kept. And but the part that interested me the most is what was missing, which I think is part of the intrigue for when we talk about these family histories, what's missing. It's the missing part that we go after, right? And I wanted to know more about why, in particular, my family, the Acadian story that's best known is probably about the Acadians that went along the eastern seaboard, and many eventually made their way into Louisiana and became the Cajuns, right? And some of those in my family line certainly were part of that story. But I was interested in ones that stayed and went north into New Brunswick and that area. And then I read a little bit about Camp d'Espérance, which was Camp of Hope, which I thought was ironic considering it was a small island in Miramichi, where something like 400 people died one winter just after the expulsion because they were fugitives, basically on the run from the English. And that story interested me. And of course, there was very little, there's a lot more out about it now than when I started, but a lot of research has been done. But I wanted to know what happened there and what that was like. And there is probably a dark side of myself that is drawn to the tragedies, so yeah, so that's kind of where Bremer's story goes, that experience of going to Camp d'Espérance. I also just thought the irony was kind of irresistible, but I did go to the Maritimes a lot of time in terms of research. I did actually visit Stephen White. I went to Grand Pré, where the story of Evangeline is kind of the Acadian story, although that's been contested lately for good reason, because Longfellow never set foot in Acadia. So, but yeah, so it's
I can ask you a question about structure. You mentioned that it's sort of like weaving three novellas together, three episodes. I would have thought that would be a real challenge. Right? Tell me about the difficulties.
well, I think when I first wrote the first drafts, or it was sprawling, and the feedback I got at that time was there's too much. I got, I had Lisa's mother's story in the beginning. I had, a lot more characters, and I was getting into this whole thing about identity, and Lisa's mother was Indigenous and adopted. I guess I have a fascination with that history and the intergenerational stuff, I guess. So I had to narrow it down. And it was really hard, but then I thought, well, maybe if I could learn to write a novella, I could narrow it down. So I told myself, limit the action to one, brief period of time, whether it's, I think traditionally a novella is really only 1 day or something like that, but I cheated in the last, especially the last section. But I did, in Lisa's story, it's really only a matter of a few days. And in Appoline's, it's a couple of winter months. And then the third, I allowed her to go kind of back and forth. I was starting to write lyric essays and playing with time and all that kind of fun. So I had fun doing it, but it was hard. But I have had feedback that it could have been longer. So I don't know, but I enjoyed it.
So I haven't read it yet. Are they one after the other, or are they woven together?
No, they're not really. Well, the thing that weaves, the thing that appears in every section, I guess you could say, is the Charleville musket. So that's the thing that sort of, yeah, that's maybe the link in all of them. And there's some kind of violence in all of them, because I was exploring the idea of, is violence passed down in one way or another, and estrangement. I don't know. What are your thoughts on intergenerational stuff?
Yes,
because you mentioned that.
Well, I started from a place where I was thinking about the culture of the Hutterite family that I grew up in, and I think by extension maybe the culture of the other Hutterite relatives that I know and knew as a teenager when we moved to Saskatchewan, being one of secrecy, privacy, not sharing, not hugging, not a whole lot of communication about anything really, but certainly no sharing of emotion, and everything you'd keep everything to yourself. It's just how it was. So I started with that as family traits, and then I have observed in my own life and in the lives of people I know what kind of effects that has on who people become, and carrying that kind of secrets, any kinds of secrets, and not sharing them, and not passing on information, or not passing on emotional well-being. So that kind of underlaid it. And then it became a question of, all right, so what are other forms of trauma? You know, does it have to be physical trauma? Can it be something that happens? What about if there's an illness? You know, if there's an illness that is inherited, how does that affect the family? So they all kind of sneak in. But yes, I definitely think that. What was the question?
Yeah, there is this. I thought it is simple patterns of being in the world, and I saw in all of these characters that they were estranged in some way from the main society. So they felt they were on the outside. Even Lise, it's a contemporary world, but she works this very good job as a teacher, and she goes and works night shift in the Berkeley. I mean, what I love writing about in novels, you don't really have to come to any super concrete conclusions, but in terms of those bigger questions, but I do think in one way or another, yeah, there is evidence. I mean, we're talking about that so much. So many people are writing stories that weren't told in their families now. I think that's really exciting. There are those patterns. Questions?
Place and specificity.
Yeah,
Very specific to.
That's very specific to a place in this particular country. That probably wouldn't have happened anywhere else.
yeah.
Yeah, but then I start wondering, all right, could this have happened in France?
Yeah, I don't know. And I think maybe we've reached a moment, haven't we, in Canada, where these stories are coming forward, and we're wanting to be really clear that they happened here. And we brought, I mean, the country was settled by people who often were fleeing some kind of trauma or another to this, you know, to Canada, or to what we now call Canada. But it was a lot of history that was brought here. But we're maybe at a time where we're ready to claim it and talk about it. I mean, it's interesting what you were saying about not talking about the stuff in the family, and it was like that with me too. The past did not matter. We don't talk about the past. There's no need to.
In Patrick Lane's memoir, there is a season for 2004. Without the past, I can't learn to live in the unfolding present. This bit of history called the new millennium wants to forget, but forgetting means having to repeat everything that came before. While the past can be a burden, it is also a gift out of time. The clear moments of memory must be understood. It is only then that they can be let go.
Nice.
It's another quote, the past ain't dead, it ain't even past yet.
Well,
What, say it again?
The past ain't dead, it ain't even past. How's it go?
the past, it's not dead, it isn't even past.
We live with it.
Yeah.
So, I'm thinking about the plight of Native Canadians who were killed, robbed, sickened, talk about trauma.
Yeah.
And the intergenerational trauma continues on to today.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, the conscience of The colonialists has been pricked, and everybody is thinking about reconciliation. Has there been reconciliation for the Acadians?
I think much more so than the indigenous people. I just didn't say that. There's a lot to account for across this country for the indigenous people. For the Acadians, that's a good, I don't know that there's been an official apology. I think there might have been, and I'm forgetting now. And if you are on the East Coast, you know, there's much more awareness of the Acadian history, you know.
Are they still discriminated against? in some
My
ways?
understanding is no. I mean, there's representation in government. There's Acadians in government. There's Acadians in you know, you see in literature writers. There's Acadian writers that but it gets complicated in Canada, really, doesn't it? Because they're mostly write in French, they're French speakers. So then there's, you know, how much, you know, some French people would feel that they're underrepresented, and you know, it gets complicated by the language barrier. In other words, the language difference. I think one of the things is that in Anglo Canada, we're not as aware of the stories, and so I suppose in that sense, and I don't really feel I can talk for. Having said all that, I can't talk for Acadians because I've grown up Anglo. Yeah, I've made a connection with someone on the East Coast who's recently wrote a book about, his name happens to be LeBlanc, Tyler LeBlanc, and he's we figured out we probably descended from the same line, and he's same story. He's Anglo, his book is written in English. He knew nothing about his Acadian ancestry until recently. So it's not that uncommon, but in terms of rights and land, oh no, I think it's not like they got their land back, you know. I mean, that community is scattered. It's interesting that the Hutterites were not in the colonies after coming here. When the Acadians came back after the expulsion, that's not entirely true. There are towns that are mostly Acadian, Shedican, many towns on the East Coast. But I don't know that group identity, certainly out here, is not as strong as maybe it once was. So,
I think we've probably got time for one more question if you want, or I can.
Well, if anybody has a burning question, go for it. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.
All right, I'll just say a quick word before I let you mingle. I'd like to thank Judy and Dee for being with us again tonight. I'll invite you to meet these authors at the signing table over there with your copies of The Broken Heart of Winter and Danceland Diary, which are on the desk there. You are more than welcome to get your copies signed before you purchase them. Just please make sure to stop the cash desk on your way out the door. Thank you all so much for supporting local writers and independent booksellers. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.
Yeah.